Bright Duty. Every student matters.
So, we have looked at the background to the formation or the framing of the Constitution and the making of the Constituent Assembly. That becomes the background to the whole formation of Constitution, and there are some questions which comes up from the part which we have discussed. So I'll just read out few of those questions so that this part is clear to you from the questions which we will now address. So the questions are: when did Constitution of India come into force? So the answer is the Indian Constitution came into force on 26 January 1950. And the period in which the Constitution was framed, and we just mentioned that the Constituent Assembly was responsible for the framing of the Constitution. So this Constituent Assembly framed the Constitution between December 1946 and November 1949. Approx 3 years it took for the Constituent Assembly to frame our Constitution, and which came into effect on the Republic Day, that is 26 January in the year 1950. Another question is: what was the immediate problem which Indians faced at the time of partition? And we know we have been talking about this refugee and the problem they gave birth to. So the main immediate problem was the rehabilitation of millions of refugees. When people were dispossessed and displaced as a result of the division or the partition, the newly formed Indian government had to take care or had to be responsible towards the millions of refugees, and this became an immediate problem for the Indian government to face. And the next question is: give any 3 problems faced by India at the time of the partition of the country. So in the background, while discussing how these times were both exciting and disappointing, we had seen what all were the problems which was making this time a disappointing one. We saw partition, which was the major problem, and what resulted in rehabilitation of refugees and the integration of the native states to the Indian Union. These were the 3 major problems the country faced immediately after the partition of the country. Another short or one-word question is: how many princely states were there in India at the time of partition of the country? And the answer is 542 princely states were there. And the Indian Union had to think of various ways to integrate these princely states into the Indian Union. And it was an uphill task, a task which was very difficult. So some of the questions which come in regard to this topic is: describe the history of the framing of the Indian Constituent Assembly. Here it will be a long answer question where you will have to bring the kind of developments in regard to the Constituent Assembly, that is beginning from 1928, when we saw that the Nehru Committee and the Swaraj's Party for the first time demands a Constituent Assembly for the framing of the Constitution, but it is not met. And in 1934, again a demand is made by the Indian National Congress. That is also not given proper attention by the British. And in 1939, the Congress Working Committee again raises this demand for a Constituent Assembly. That also fails to get any attention. And then in 1942, during or before the World War II, again the British realized that they'll have to kind of give attention to what the Indians are demanding. So in 1942, as a result, the Cripps mission is sent to India to lay down the formation of a Constituent Assembly. But Indians reject this mission and the proposal it makes for the making of the Constituent Assembly. And in 1946, finally, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee accepts or admits that the Constituent Assembly should be made and Indians should be given the responsibility to frame a constitution. So following this, the Constitution essay on the Constituent Assembly of India. So here too, beginning from 1928 to 1946, the developments which we have now talked about, and from 1946 to 1950, when the final framing of the Constitution happens, these are the things which you will have to write in detail under this question. And describe the role of the Constituent Assembly before 15th August 1947. Here too, you will have to bring the developments beginning from 1928. So there are some questions which come from this objective resolution and the details related to it. Some of those questions we will just see what they are. So one question is, what were the ideals expressed in the objective resolution? So as we just discussed, the ideals included guaranteeing and securing to all the people of India, irrespective of their class, caste, gender, sex, certain kind of constitutional rights, which included justice, freedom, and equality. The next question which comes up from this topic is, what was objective resolution and what is its significance? So this is also something which we have just now discussed. So the objective resolution was the passing of resolution on aims and objectives of the Constitution. This resolution made clear or wrote down what the aims and objectives of the Constitution should be. And its significance was that it ensured safeguards and provided minorities and the depressed classes with certain rights which the government of India ensured through Constitution. And there lies the significance of the Constitution, that irrespective of the background of the citizen, every citizen of the country was ensured constitutional rights like equality, justice, and freedom. The third question which comes in relation to this topic is, who moved the objective resolution in the Constituent Assembly? So this is also something which we talked about, and that is, the resolution was moved by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in the year 1946, dated December 13. So it was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru who passed or moved the resolution in the Constituent Assembly. So now we will go on to discuss some questions which are related to the topic which we have been discussing. So the first question is, who was the chairman of the Constituent Assembly Drafting Committee? We know there were different committees. So while answering this question, you'll have to take care of what committee it has been talking about. If it's asking the Union Power Committee, the chairman will be a different person. So here the question is chairman of the Constituent Assembly's drafting committee, and the answer, as you know, is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Next question is, when was the Constituent Assembly established? It is in year 1946 on December that the Constituent Assembly is getting established. The other question is, who was elected as the permanent president of the Constituent Assembly? We saw that initially when the Constituent Assembly was met, it was Sachidanand Sinha who was appointed the temporary chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and later Dr. Rajendra Prasad was appointed as the permanent president of the Constituent Assembly. And the same question in a different form, who was the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and it was Dr. Rajendra Prasad. And when did Constitution of India come into force? This is the most significant day for any Indian, and it is the Republic Day, January 26, year 1950. And another question is, when did Pakistan come into existence? And it was 14th August 1947, a day before India attained independence. So there are some more questions related to what we have been discussing. One is, what was the attitude of Muslim League towards Constituent Assembly? The attitude was negative, and we saw that the Muslim League had not participated in the Constituent Assembly because they had demanded a separate territory for Muslim minorities. So they were absent from the Constituent Assembly. Give the names of any three committees appointed by the Constituent Assembly. So we just looked at the different committees which were set up by the Constituent Assembly. So some of them are Union Power Committee, Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities and Tribal Excluded Areas. So this is the second committee which we had looked at. And the third and the most significant committee appointed by the Constituent Assembly was the Drafting Committee. So you must remember some of those names, and these three were the significant committees which worked under Constituent Assembly, and there were several other committees and subcommittees which were working alongside. Another question is, describe any two basic values of the Indian Constitution. So it is ensuring of equality and justice to all its citizens, equal treatment of all its citizens, and a just treatment, ensuring justice to everyone in the country. So one of the questions which comes from the topics which we have discussed now is, describe the different arguments given in favor of the protection of oppressed groups. So we just saw the oppressed sections and their participation in the Constituent Assembly, and what kind of demands the representatives of these oppressed sections are making, like the tribals and the Dalit groups, what demands they are asking for, and how they reach a consensus, and what kind of requests the Constituent Assembly is also giving in order to address the problems faced by the oppressed sections. So it is a long answer, and here you will have to bring in the different debates and discussions which is going around in the Constituent Assembly during the 1946 to 49. So now we look at some questions which are related to the topics which we have looking at. So the question 1 is, What were the arguments in favor of greater power to the provinces? So we saw there are several arguments which are made in support of greater power for the center and also for the provinces. For the center, we saw how Nehru writes a letter to the President of the Constituent Assembly saying that in the aftermath of partition, how important it is for India to have a very strong central government. But then we saw people like K. Santanam also making claims in support of a power for the state government or more power for the state government. So you'll have to bring in all the different claims which K. Santanam is making, and then what is the fear which he is talking about, and how he feels that if the division of power is not properly taken up, their states will revolt against the central government. So these are the points which you will have to talk about under this question. And another question is, explain how the Constitution of India protects the rights of the central government and the states. So the Constitution in which ways are protecting the rights of the central government and the states. So this is a question which we will address in the coming slides, and then we'll discuss about the certain provisions which Constitution is bringing to address this issue of sharing of power between central government and the state. So the question which comes up from this part is, what connection did some of the members of the Constituent Assembly make between the political situation of the time and the need for a strong center? So here, in regard to the political situation of the time, you will have to refer to the partition and the violence it had engendered or given shape to, and the fear of such adversary or adverse situations led many of our leaders to think about a center which was more powerful and which had more authority than the provinces. So the question which is related to this topic is, how did the Constituent Assembly seek to resolve the language controversy? So we saw how the language committee gives a report to the Constituent Assembly where a gradual transition to Hindi was proposed. So you have to bring in, it's a long answer question. So you'll have to talk about the debates going around and the people who are supporting Hindi as the national language, and how a section within the Constituent Assembly is opposing this approach, and how then language committee brings a compromise through its report and proposal. So now let's discuss few questions from this topic. So one question is, what was the attitude of Mahatma Gandhi about the national language? So while discussing the debates on national language, we saw how Gandhi had supported Hindustani, or he wanted Hindustani, which was a blend of Hindi and Urdu, as the national language of India. And the other question is, why did Mahatma Gandhi think that Hindustani should be the national language? So that's also something which we just now discussed, that it is because of the reason that the Hindustani is a blend of Hindi and Urdu, and where both the traditions of the Hindus and the Muslim communities come together and give rise or give birth to a shared culture of love, harmony and peace. So this is the reason why Gandhi preferred a language which was a blend of both Islamic and Hindu traditions over a language which was of one particular community. So the question on this topic is, describe the arguments given by Dr. Ambedkar in the assembly in justification of establishing parliamentary government in India. So this is something which we just now discussed, because he felt that the poverty and illiteracy of the masses might encourage the executive to go into despotism or dictatorship. So under the parliamentary system, there is a periodic assessment of the responsibility of the government, or checks and balances on the power of government. So the question on this topic is, describe the views of eminent members of the assembly about incorporation of directive principles of state policy. So this is something which we have just now discussed. Here different members, for some members it is here different set of members. For some members the directive principles are insignificant. But we see people like Ambedkar say that it is on the basis of which both the legislature and executive should function. So the question on this is, how did Dr. Ambedkar justify the incorporation of emergency powers of the President of India in the Constituent Assembly? So we just talked about the emergency powers of the President, and the question is, how is Ambedkar justifying this? So we saw, according to Ambedkar, the spirit of Constitution points clearly to the fact that President is merely a nominal figurehead and he has no discretion and powers on administration at all. So it is difficult, even if the President is ambitious, it is difficult for the President to assert or to acquire power.